The topic is the rise and the emergence of untwisted toroidal flux ropes on the sun. So Kalman, thank you very much. Amy has referenced a couple things for you, so I think we're looking forward to hearing what you've been doing in some more detail.
All right, thanks, Todd. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. So as the title suggests, I'll be talking about the rise and emergence of flux on the sun. But I want to emphasize that although I'll be talking about models, really what we're aiming for is to try to understand the observations that SDO has given us over the last 10 years. Here's just a nice movie that I pulled down from a couple weeks ago showing an active region emerging over the course of a couple days. And you see these strong polarities emerging, and then a lot of salt and pepper flux in between them, sort of coming out just over a couple days. And really what we're trying to understand is, how does this flux get there? How does it rise in the convection zone? How does it emerge through the photosphere? And then what does it do in the corona? And really the only way we can really answer that is through modeling right now. So the specific question that I'm looking at is, how twisted are rising flux ropes? And the reason that it's important is because twist is typically associated with free energy, and so we want to get a sense of how much twist is on these things. But the thing is that if you do a 2D flux emergence simulation, then what you find is that in the convection zone, the viscous forces are so strong that they're going to basically tear this rising thing to shreds. They're going to generate these counter-rotating vortices, which generate a Kutta-Zhukovsky force, which will stop the rise. And so it won't really rise in any coherent manner unless there's a large twist, which will help the thing maintain its coherence. And in 3D, we find something similar, which is that if the flux rope is able to make it to near the photosphere, it still needs a relatively large twist in order to build up a strong magnetic gradient to lift the plasma. The photospheric plasma is heavy, and so there needs to be some force up to lift the plasma. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But just as an example, Toriumi and Yokoyama in 2011 were able to emerge, though they struggled to do so, a flux rope with a twist of about 1 radian per megameter. So both of these things indicate that really you need a significant twist in order to rise coherently and emerge through the photosphere. And this would be fine, except that the observational results indicate that the photospheric twist is quite low. So on the right here, you see a plot from a paper by Pevtsov et al., where they measured the average force-free parameter, twist parameter alpha, in a set of active regions, and they find an average value that's maybe 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the twist that we're finding in the flux emergence simulation. So on the one hand, the model seems to suggest that the twist should be rather large, but the photospheric observation suggests that the twist may be quite low. So how do we reconcile this? So based on a suggestion actually in one of Bill Abbott's papers in the early 2000s, we thought that the answer might have to do with the shape of the rising flux rope. So most of the papers that study flux emergence use a cylinder that is made buoyant in some small section of it and rises as an omega loop. But we decided to try to put in a half torus into our simulation to see what happens to it as it is made buoyant. So we initialize the simulation with a half torus with no twist whatsoever. We're going to ignore convection for this study, and we're going to use the layer 3D code to study what happens to the untwisted half torus as it rises and after it's made buoyant. So you can see in our simulation we've got a convection zone, a small photosphere, a chromosphere transition region, and corona. So here are some figures from the evolution of its rise in the convection zone. So here's our initial half torus. and as it rises, it becomes more triangular. The field lines at the apex flatten out. The colored shading here represents vertical momentum, and the black contours are out of plane vorticity. And what you find is that you still get vortices, but in the cross-sectional cuts of magnetic field here, you can see that they actually don't destroy the rising flux rope. The cross-section expands in radius as it tries to keep pressure balance, but you don't generate these counter-rotating vortices that you saw in the previous slides. So this is already an interesting result, that with a half torus, you do get a coherent rise through the convection zone. So at the photosphere, we do see emergence, and that's also an interesting result for an untwisted torus, for an untwisted flux rope to show emergence. And you see sort of these narrow lanes forming, lots of salt and pepper structure, and there are two, the main polarities form here when the legs of the flux rope emerge. And so there's a lot of similarities here, at least qualitatively, to what's observed by HMI, for example. And so one of the things we can do to quantitatively compare the results to HMI is use kernel density estimation, which is a technique developed by Sally Dacie about 5 years ago, where basically she makes a histogram of all of the magnetic field strengths in the active region, and then fits part of that to a slope, or to a line, and gets the slope of that line. So that's called a kernel density estimate. It's basically a type of histogram. And so we did that for our simulation. We plotted the slope as a function of time here on the right. And the gray shaded region represents the range of values observed in active regions by Dacie et al. In 2016, 2017. And you can see that we, not for the entire duration of the simulation, but we do reproduce a lot of the observed slopes, at least for an early to middle portion of our simulation. So at least quantitatively, we're getting there in terms of reproducing the observed distributions of flux. There's still some work, of course, to explain these deviations. So one of the things that we can do in simulations that we can't quite do in observations yet is plot field lines. And so I'm showing here 4 times in the simulation from the side and from above, where I'm plotting field lines, and you can see that as the torus approaches the photosphere, the field lines sort of flatten out and expand out as it approaches the photosphere from below. And here you can see the yellow field lines begin to undulate in and out of the photosphere, forming these narrow crescent-shaped lanes. As the emergence proceeds, you can even see the red field lines are starting to undulate. The yellow field lines have more and more undulations. And then eventually you get these M-shaped loops. And you can already see that these loops are quite likely to reconnect as they continue to emerge. And in fact, that is what we see. Here I'm plotting a series of snapshots with field lines plotted right before an energetic event. And you can see that the lobes are reconnecting. The field lines are plotted by the component of the magnetic field, and the color shading is the vertical velocity. And you can see that there's a large outflow where there's a reconnection event. There's a drop in magnetic energy. And so we identify this event with Ellerman bombs, which there's some evidence for in the observational literature. Etienne Pariat and others had a nice paper in 2004 where they found undulating field lines and an associated Ellerman bomb. Sobe in 2007, 2009 also identified Ellerman bombs with undulating field lines. And so there's a lot of evidence that undulating field lines are associated with these types of energetic events. Now, the way that the flux actually emerges through the photosphere is interesting because there's also some evidence for that in the observational literature. But basically, it's the magnetic buoyancy instability, or a mode of that instability. So the thing is that photospheric plasma is quite heavy, and from initially the magnetic field doesn't have enough force to lift it up above the photosphere. But as the magnetic field starts to pile up below the photosphere, you generate a strong magnetic gradient, and that is able to eventually lift up that plasma once it exceeds the downward force. And what you get is you build up this this concave down loop, which barely peaks up out of the photosphere. And when that happens, you can see that you can imagine that the plasma at the top of this loop will immediately be able to drain, right? And that decreases the weight of the plasma at the top of the loop, and so the perturbation is able to grow, right? This is how the undular instability works, and it's been argued in several papers that this is a mechanism for flux emergence at the photosphere. And again, Pariat 2004 found some evidence of this as well. So what we can do is we can quantify this by doing something like plotting the BZ at the photosphere in our simulation. Let's say across this yellow line, if we plot BZ, you can see as a function of the coordinate and as a function of time, and then we can fit the data to we can decompose it into its modes and find a fastest growing wave number, which is circled here in red. So it's about 0.3 per photospheric scale height. And we can do that in the other direction as well. But the cool thing is that the undular instability is well studied in the literature. There are a lot of theoretical papers deriving the fastest growing wave number and the growth rate of that instability, starting with Chandrasekhar in 61, and then Atchison. Yu-Hung Fan did this as well. And we found a fastest growing wave number that was, and growth rate that was right, exactly what the theory predicted. The wavelength of the fastest growing wave number is about 3 to 4 megameters at the photosphere. So if you see features that indicate undulating field lines.
Well, if anybody has something they'd like to talk about that doesn't involve.
Sorry, when did you lose me?
Oh, about 2 minutes ago.
Oh, sorry about that.
If you put up your slides, we can probably tell you about where we were.
All right.
You have about 2 or 3 minutes left. So maybe why don't you resume from about 2 or 3 minutes from the end, and we'll be perfect.
Did you hear this part?
Yeah, we did hear that part.
And this part?
Yes. No.
Okay. Well,
we heard about half of that one, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. We were able to pin down the undular instability as being the source for the emergence at the photosphere of the flux, and match it to the analytical theory. Okay, I'll put up my conclusion slide. I don't want to take any more time, but it seems like twist is not needed to rise coherently or emerge, as long as the shape of the rising flux rope is correct.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Sorry we got interrupted there. It must have been a button pushed by somebody someplace in the universe that made it happen. We do have a couple questions. One is from Katie Lecca, which was, it would be interesting to examine the distribution of twist from the simulations within a single active regions with those from the observations. And the comment is, the mean shown by Pevsov 95 is small, but the distribution of twists in the elements in an active region is fairly broad. And she points to a couple of her older papers that she may have mentioned something relative to that. So do you have any thought about looking at the distribution of twists from simulations?
Yeah, we've been trying to get some observers to do that for some time. And I think KD's papers are some of the only ones that that try to do it. Most of these measurements are basically averages over active regions, and so in some of my papers, that's what I have attempted to do, is just to average over active regions, because that's what the the numbers that I have to compare to. But yeah, I think looking at it in more detail is definitely more important than just doing a simple average.
Yeah, I think what she's suggesting is that you look at the distribution from the model results and then compare that with the distribution from the observations, and then
I would agree with that. That's something we should do, and get more statistics from the observations as well.
Yeah,
more active regions.
And then there's a comment from Hugh Hudson. There's a suggestion by Gonzalez Manrique that the earliest AFS loops are twisted, but that the twist then somehow disappears. Do you have any thoughts on how that could work, or do you think it isn't needed?
I'm not familiar with that paper, but I think that the twist in the corona, for example, is different than the quantity that's being measured at the photosphere, and certainly, reconnection will make it seem like twist has disappeared when in reality it's just moving to larger scales. So I'm not entirely sure what to say about that, because I'm not familiar with that work.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to pose in the chat? Otherwise, it looks like we're pretty much right on time. As I understand it, there will be breakout rooms open shortly. There'll be one from carrying over from the sessions earlier this morning on the subsurface flows. There'll be the magnetic field ones that you can also look into. And then there's sort of a general chat room if you just want to chat like you would at a meeting where you didn't have to actually interact with any of the speakers, but or just wanted to renew some social ties and talk about other things. So we'll just go off into the breakout rooms and off we go. And thank you for coming. We have about nominally 15 minutes, but I think the breakout rooms will be open for 35 or 40 minutes. So you can stay as long as the discussions are productive for you.